When Lisa and her husband Mike first drove through the gates of Pine Valley Estates, they thought they had found their dream home. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Every lawn was perfectly trimmed, the streets were spotless, and the houses all had that fresh, well-maintained look that screamed good investment. The real estate agent had mentioned it was an HOA community, but Lisa figured that just meant they'd have nice amenities and property values would stay high. What nobody told them about was Margaret. Margaret lived in the house directly across the street, and she had been the unofficial queen of Pine Valley Estates for the past 12 years. At 58 years old, she had silver hair that she kept in a tight bun and always wore cardigans, even in summer. She had this way of watching everything that happened in the neighborhood from behind her pristine white curtains, like she was running surveillance on the whole street. The first sign of trouble came just 3 days after Lisa and Mike moved in. Lisa was unpacking boxes on the front porch when she noticed a woman standing at the end of their driveway, holding a clipboard and frowning. The woman introduced herself as Margaret and said she was there for a welcome inspection to make sure everything was up to community standards. Lisa thought it was a bit odd, but she figured maybe this was just how things worked in HOA neighborhoods. Margaret walked around their property with her clipboard, making little notes and muttering under her breath. She measured the distance between their car and the curb with an actual tape measure. She counted the number of flower pots on their porch. She even took photos of their mailbox from different angles. "Your mailbox is fine," Margaret announced when she finished, like she was doing them a huge favor. "But those flower boxes need to be regulation blue. The current color is more of a navy, and our community standards specifically call for royal blue. You'll need to repaint them within 2 weeks." Lisa politely asked to see the community guidelines, thinking maybe she had missed something in all the paperwork. Margaret's face got tight, and she said the guidelines were common knowledge and that any serious homeowner would understand the importance of maintaining standards. That night, Lisa spent 2 hours reading through every single page of the HOA documents. Nowhere did it mention anything about specific shades of blue for flower boxes. In fact, the color guidelines were pretty relaxed, just saying that exterior decorations should be tasteful and harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic. But Margaret wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, she found something new to complain about almost every day. Mike's car was parked improperly, even though it was completely in their driveway. Their garbage cans were put out too early, even though they followed the same schedule as everyone else on the street. Their lawn sprinklers were too loud, even though they ran them at the same time their neighbors did. The worst part was how Margaret went about her complaints. She didn't just come over and talk to them like a normal neighbor. Instead, she would leave formal-looking notices on their door, typed up on official-looking letterhead that said Pine Valley Estates Property Management at the top. These notices were full of big words and legal-sounding language that made everything sound way more serious than it actually was. Lisa started to get suspicious when she realized Margaret was the only person in the neighborhood who seemed to care about these so-called violations. Their next-door neighbors, the Johnsons, were friendly and normal. They told Lisa that Margaret had been pulling this stuff for years, but most people just ignored her because she didn't actually have any real authority. "She's not even on the HOA board," Mrs. Johnson explained while they were chatting over the fence. "She tried to get elected a few years back, but nobody voted for her. Now she just pretends like she's in charge of everything." This made Lisa even more frustrated. She had been stressing out over these notices, thinking she was somehow breaking actual rules and might get fined or something. Finding out that Margaret was basically just a busybody neighbor with too much time on her hands was both a relief and incredibly annoying. Things got worse when Margaret found out that Lisa worked from home. Lisa was a legal consultant who helped small businesses with contracts and compliance issues. It was completely legitimate work that she did over the phone and computer, and she had all the proper business licenses and permits. Her home office was just a spare bedroom with a desk and some filing cabinets. But Margaret became obsessed with the idea that Lisa was running some kind of illegal business operation. She started taking photos of anyone who came to their house, even though most of Lisa's work was done remotely. When the UPS driver delivered packages, Margaret would come out and try to see what was being delivered. When Lisa had a friend over for lunch, Margaret assumed it was a business meeting and took notes about how long the friends stayed, the photography. Thing was what really crossed the line for Lisa. She noticed Margaret, standing in her front yard with a camera, taking pictures of their house from different angles. When Lisa went outside to ask what she was doing, Margaret claimed she was documenting violations for the HOA board. But Lisa had already talked to the real HOA board by this point, and they had no idea what Margaret was talking about. Margaret's behavior got more and more bizarre as the weeks went on. She bought a pair of binoculars and would sit by her front window, watching their house like she was conducting a stakeout. She started timing how long visitors stayed and keeping a log of their license plate numbers. She even bought one of those laser measuring devices so she could check if their grass was exactly the right height. The breaking point came when Margaret started bothering Lisa's clients. She had somehow figured out Lisa's business phone number and started calling people, claiming that Lisa was operating an unlicensed business and that any contracts she had worked on might be invalid. This was not only completely false, but it was also potentially damaging to Lisa's reputation and livelihood. Lisa realized she needed to take action when one of her longtime clients called, confused and concerned about Margaret's call. The client had been working with Lisa for 3 years and trusted her completely. But Margaret's official-sounding accusations had planted seeds of doubt. That evening, Lisa and Mike sat down to figure out what to do. They could move, but they had just bought the house and really loved everything about the neighborhood except for Margaret. They could try to ignore her, but her behavior was escalating and starting to affect Lisa's work. They could confront her directly, but every attempt at polite conversation had only seemed to make her more determined. Mike suggested they start documenting everything Margaret was doing, just in case they needed to prove harassment or get the police involved. Lisa agreed, and they began keeping a detailed log of Margaret's activities. They noted every photo she took, every fake notice she left, every time she stood in their yard with her measuring devices. What they didn't know was that Margaret was keeping her own log, convinced that she was building a case against them. In Margaret's mind, she was the hero of this story, protecting the neighborhood from people who didn't respect the rules. She had no idea that her own behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged and that she was about to cross a line that would have serious legal consequences. As Lisa watched Margaret through the window, standing in her yard with binoculars pointed at their house, she had no way of knowing that this situation was about to escalate in ways none of them could have imagined. Margaret's obsession with proving that Lisa was somehow breaking the rules was about to lead her down a path that would end with real legal trouble, not the imaginary violations she had been chasing for months. Margaret's behavior took a dramatic turn after Lisa started documenting her activities. It was like she could sense that people were no longer taking her seriously. And instead of backing down, she decided to double down on her authority claims in ways that nobody saw coming. The first sign that things were getting worse happened on a Tuesday morning when Lisa was getting her mail. She noticed Margaret talking to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. Margaret was wearing what looked like an official badge pinned to her cardigan and carrying a fancy leather folder instead of her usual clipboard. Lisa couldn't hear everything they were saying, but she caught pieces of the conversation. Margaret was telling Mrs. Chen that as the newly appointed vice president of property standards, she needed to conduct a mandatory inspection of Mrs. Chen's backyard shed. The poor woman looked confused and a little scared, nodding along while Margaret made notes in her folder. When Mrs. Chen went back inside, Lisa walked over to Margaret. She tried to keep her voice friendly and asked about this vice president position. Margaret's whole demeanor changed. She stood up straighter, adjusted her fake badge, and launched into this speech about how the HOA board had finally recognized her years of dedicated service to the community. "I've been monitoring property values and compliance issues for over a decade," Margaret said, her voice taking on this official tone. "The board realized they needed someone with my expertise to handle the more serious violations that have been overlooked." Lisa knew this was complete nonsense. She had spoken to the actual HOA board president just last week, and there was no vice president position. The board only had 3 members, and they met once a month to discuss basic maintenance issues like pool cleaning and snow removal. But Margaret was so convincing in her performance that Lisa could see how other neighbors might believe her. Over the next few days, Margaret began her campaign of fake authority with frightening efficiency. She printed up business cards that said, "Margaret Wilson, VP Property Standards, Pine Valley Estates." She bought a professional-looking badge holder and made herself an ID card with her photo and fake title. She even got a magnetic sign for her car that made it look official. The scariest part was how Margaret had clearly researched real HOA procedures and legal language. Her fake notices now included references to actual city codes and state laws about property maintenance. To someone who didn't know better, these documents looked completely legitimate. She had headers with the community logo, footer text about appeals processes, and even fake signature lines for board approval. Margaret started targeting different neighbors each week, always with the same routine. She would show up at their door wearing her badge, carrying her official-looking folder, and explaining that she was there for a routine compliance inspection. Most people were so caught off guard that they just went along with it. She told Mr. Rodriguez that his fence was 3 inches too high and needed to be shortened within 30 days or he would face a $500 fine. She informed the Peterson family that their children's swing set violated recreational equipment placement guidelines and had to be moved to a different part of their yard. She even convinced the Thompsons to repaint their front door because the current color allegedly didn't meet the community's historical preservation standards. None of these rules existed. Margaret was making them up as she went along, but she was so confident and official-sounding that people believed her. Lisa watched in horror as her neighbors spent their weekends and money fixing imaginary violations rather than risk getting fined by what they thought was a legitimate authority. The situation got more disturbing when Margaret started holding what she called community standards meetings in her living room. She invited different neighbors each week, serving coffee and cookies while presenting PowerPoint slides about property maintenance and compliance issues. These meetings were like bizarre performances where Margaret played the role of a concerned official trying to help everyone avoid violations. During these meetings, Margaret would show before and after photos of neighbors' properties, pointing out improvements that had been made after her inspections. She had charts showing property values and graphs demonstrating how compliance rates had improved since she started her work. She even had testimonials from neighbors thanking her for helping them avoid costly fines and legal issues. Lisa realized that Margaret had created an entire alternate reality where she was the hero of the neighborhood, saving everyone from some imaginary HOA enforcement crisis. The most chilling part was how much effort Margaret had put into making this fantasy seem real. She had spent hundreds of dollars on props, printing, and materials to support her fake authority. But Margaret's obsession with Lisa hadn't diminished at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. Margaret became convinced that Lisa was somehow undermining her authority by asking too many questions and encouraging other neighbors to verify her claims. In Margaret's mind, Lisa had become the villain who was trying to create chaos in the community. Margaret started telling other neighbors that Lisa was a troublemaker who didn't respect community standards. She claimed that Lisa's home-based business was bringing undesirable elements into the neighborhood and that her questions about HOA procedures were just attempts to find loopholes so she could break more rules. The lies got more elaborate and more personal. Margaret told Mrs. Johnson that Lisa had been rude and confrontational during their conversations. She told the Chens that Lisa's business was probably illegal and that they should be careful about associating with her. She even started suggesting that Lisa might be running some kind of scam operation from her home office. Things reached a new level of crazy when Margaret discovered that Lisa had previously worked as a paralegal. Margaret somehow found this information by going through Lisa's social media profiles and piecing together details from her professional background. This discovery sent Margaret into what could only be described as a paranoid spiral. Margaret became convinced that Lisa was investigating her, possibly on behalf of the real HOA board or even law enforcement. She started changing her routine, taking different routes when she walked around the neighborhood and checking over her shoulder like she was being followed. She installed security cameras around her own house and began keeping detailed logs of Lisa's daily activities. The irony was that Lisa really was starting to investigate Margaret, but not for any official reason. Lisa was just trying to protect herself and her neighbors from Margaret's increasingly aggressive harassment. She had started researching Margaret's background, looking into whether she had any real authority or if there were legal ways to stop her behavior. What Lisa discovered was disturbing. Margaret had been involved in similar situations in 2 previous neighborhoods where she had lived. In both cases, she had appointed herself to unofficial neighborhood watch or property maintenance roles and had eventually been asked to stop by homeowners associations or local authorities. It seemed like Margaret had a pattern of moving to new communities and trying to establish herself as some kind of unofficial authority figure. Lisa also found out that Margaret had never actually held any real positions in property management or HOA administration. Her background was in retail management, and she had been retired for over 5 years. The expertise she claimed to have about property laws and community standards was apparently just research she had done online and information she had gathered from various sources. Armed with this information, Lisa started quietly reaching out to neighbors who had been targeted by Margaret's fake inspections. What she found was a community that was confused, frustrated, and in some cases financially harmed by Margaret's activities. Several families had spent significant money on unnecessary repairs or modifications based on Margaret's fake violations. But Margaret was not going to give up her newfound sense of power and purpose without a fight. As Lisa began organizing neighbors and questioning Margaret's authority more directly, Margaret's behavior became even more erratic and desperate. She seemed to sense that her carefully constructed fantasy was starting to crumble, and she began taking more extreme measures to maintain control. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose Margaret's deception once and for all. But nobody could have predicted just how far she would be willing to go to maintain her fake authority. Margaret's obsession with proving she was right about Lisa was about to lead her to cross lines that would have serious legal consequences, transforming her from a neighborhood nuisance into someone facing real criminal charges. Margaret's desperation reached a breaking point on what started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Lisa was in her home office preparing for a video call with a client when she noticed something strange happening across the street. Margaret was loading what looked like professional equipment into her car, a large toolbox, some kind of electronic device, and a briefcase she had never seen before. For the past week, Margaret's behavior had become even more erratic than usual. She had been making phone calls late at night that Lisa could hear through the windows, talking loudly about evidence gathering and official procedures. Margaret had also started wearing different clothes, dark pants and jackets instead of her usual colorful cardigans, like she was trying to look more official or blend in somehow. The night before, Lisa had caught Margaret doing something that made her blood run cold. Around 11 p.m., she had seen Margaret walking around the neighborhood with a flashlight, checking door handles and peering into windows. When Lisa called the police to report suspicious activity, Margaret had quickly returned to her house before the patrol car arrived. The officer who responded said they would keep an eye on things. But without catching Margaret in the act, there wasn't much they could do. Now, watching Margaret prepare for what looked like some kind of mission, Lisa had a sinking feeling that her neighbor was about to do something really stupid. Lisa's client call was scheduled for 9:30, and Mike had already left for work, so she would be alone in the house. She made sure all the doors were locked and checked that her home security system was armed and recording. The security system had been Mike's idea after Margaret's harassment escalated. It wasn't anything fancy, just cameras at the front and back doors and a monitoring app on Lisa's phone. Mike had installed it himself after watching YouTube tutorials, and they had tested it several times to make sure it worked properly. Lisa never imagined she would actually need it to catch a neighbor trying to break into their house. At exactly 9:15, just before Lisa's client call was supposed to start, Margaret made her move. Lisa was reviewing her notes when her phone buzzed with a security alert. The front door camera had detected motion, and when Lisa pulled up the video feed, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Margaret was standing on their front porch wearing all black clothes and latex gloves, holding what looked like a set of keys attached to a retractable keyring. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and what appeared to be an official-looking document in her other hand. But the most shocking thing was her demeanor. She wasn't acting sneaky or guilty like someone who knew they were doing something wrong. Instead, she looked confident and determined, like she genuinely believed she had every right to be there. Lisa watched in amazement as Margaret approached their front door and began examining the lock. She pulled out a small flashlight and shined it on the keyhole, then selected one of the keys from her ring and tried to insert it. When it didn't fit, she tried another one, and then another. Lisa realized she needed to document this properly, so she started screen recording on her phone while also letting the security system capture everything. She could hear Margaret muttering to herself as she worked, though the words were too muffled to make out clearly. What was clear was that Margaret was getting frustrated as key after key failed to work. After about 5 minutes of trying different keys, Margaret stepped back and looked around the porch area. She walked over to the windows and tried to peer inside, cupping her hands around her eyes to block the glare. She checked under the doormat and lifted a few flower pots, apparently looking for a hidden spare key. Lisa was torn between calling the police immediately and waiting to see how far Margaret would actually go. Part of her wanted to catch Margaret in the most serious criminal act possible, so there would be no doubt about what was happening. But she was also genuinely scared about what Margaret might do if she actually managed to get inside the house. Margaret returned to the door and pulled out what looked like a different set of keys. These ones were older and more worn, like she had gotten them from somewhere else. Lisa wondered if Margaret had somehow obtained keys from previous residents, or if she had made copies of keys she found somehow. The whole situation was so bizarre that Lisa was having trouble processing it. As Margaret continued her attempts to unlock the door, she started talking to herself more loudly. Lisa could now make out some of what she was saying, and it was even more disturbing than she had expected. Margaret was talking like she was conducting an official investigation, making comments about securing evidence and following proper procedures. "This is a legitimate inspection," Margaret said to herself as she tried another key. "The homeowner has been notified of violations and has failed to comply with community standards. As the designated Property Standards Vice President, I have the authority to conduct this investigation." Lisa realized that Margaret had completely lost touch with reality. She genuinely believed that her fake title gave her the right to enter people's homes, and she had apparently convinced herself that she was following some kind of official protocol. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was someone having a serious break from reality. Margaret tried several more keys before moving on to what appeared to be a small electronic device. Lisa had seen similar tools in movies and TV shows. It looked like some kind of lock-picking device or electronic lock bypass tool. Margaret held it up to the lock and pressed various buttons, apparently trying to override the security somehow. When the electronic device didn't work either, Margaret's frustration became much more visible. She started pacing back and forth on the porch, checking her watch and looking around nervously. Lisa could see that Margaret was sweating despite the cool October weather, and her movements were becoming more agitated. Then Margaret did something that crossed the line from attempted breaking and entering into full-blown criminal behavior. She walked over to the front window and tried to force it open. When that didn't work, she went to the side of the house and tried another window. Lisa watched in horror as Margaret systematically tested every accessible window and door, looking for any way to get inside. The most chilling part was that Margaret kept up her official commentary throughout the whole process. She was treating this like a legitimate law enforcement operation, talking about probable cause and evidence preservation as she tried to break into the house. It was like watching someone live out a detailed fantasy where they were the hero of their own crime drama. Margaret eventually returned to the front door for one final attempt. She pulled out what looked like a credit card and tried to slip it between the door and the frame, apparently trying to manipulate the lock mechanism. When that failed, she actually started hitting the door with her fist. Not hard enough to break it, but loud enough that Lisa could hear it clearly from inside. "This is unacceptable," Margaret said loudly, apparently no longer caring if anyone heard her. The homeowner is deliberately obstructing a legitimate inspection. This behavior violates multiple community standards and municipal codes. Lisa realized that Margaret was building up to something even more dramatic. Her body language and tone of voice suggested that she was preparing to escalate her efforts, possibly to the point of actually trying to force the door open or break a window. Lisa knew she had more than enough evidence to press charges, but she was also concerned about what Margaret might do if she continued to be frustrated. That's when Lisa had an idea that would turn this whole situation on its head. She remembered that she had received some documents earlier that morning related to one of her legal consulting cases. These documents included official court papers that looked very impressive and authoritative. If Margaret wanted to play games with fake authority, Lisa was about to show her what real legal documents looked like. Lisa quietly got up from her desk and walked over to where she had left the morning's mail. Among the various envelopes and packages was exactly what she needed, a thick manila envelope with court seals and official stamps that had arrived just an hour earlier. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Lisa stood in her hallway holding the manila envelope, her heart pounding as she listened to Margaret's increasingly frantic attempts to get inside. The envelope contained official court documents for a harassment case she was consulting on. Ironically, very similar to what Margaret was putting her through. The papers had impressive legal seals, official signatures, and the kind of authoritative formatting that would immediately grab anyone's attention. What made this moment even more perfect was that Lisa hadn't planned any of this. The documents had arrived that morning by courier, just routine paperwork for a case she was helping another attorney with. But the timing was so incredible that it almost felt like the universe was giving her the perfect tool to deal with Margaret's craziness. Through the security monitor, Lisa could see that Margaret was now pacing back and forth on the porch, clearly working herself up to try something more drastic. Margaret had taken off her jacket and was wiping sweat from her forehead, even though it was only about 60 degrees outside. She kept checking her watch and looking around the neighborhood like she was worried someone might see her, but the strangest part was that Margaret was still talking to herself, like she was conducting some kind of official operation. Lisa could hear fragments of what sounded like police procedural dialogue, as if Margaret was playing out scenes from TV crime shows in her head. "Subject is non-compliant with inspection requirements," Margaret muttered as she examined the door lock again. "Probable cause exists for emergency entry under community safety protocols." Lisa realized that Margaret had created an entire fantasy scenario where she was some kind of law enforcement officer, rather than just a delusional neighbor with too much time on her hands. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Margaret was having what could only be described as a complete psychological break from reality. Lisa decided it was time to end this madness before Margaret actually managed to damage their property or hurt herself. But instead of just calling the police and waiting for them to arrive, she was going to give Margaret a reality check that would be captured on video for everyone to see. Lisa walked to the front door and took a deep breath. Through the security monitor, she could see Margaret trying what looked like a small crowbar on the door frame. That was definitely going too far. Margaret was now attempting to actually break into their house using tools. The beautiful irony of the situation wasn't lost on Lisa. Here was Margaret, who had spent months making up fake violations and pretending to have authority she didn't possess, about to be confronted by someone holding real legal documents with actual authority behind them. Lisa positioned herself just inside the door and waited for the perfect moment. She could see Margaret getting more and more frustrated as her tools failed to work. Margaret had apparently watched too many movies about lockpicking because none of her techniques were actually effective on a modern security lock. Then, Margaret did something that crossed every possible line. She picked up one of the decorative stones from Lisa's garden and walked toward the front window. It was clear that she was considering breaking the glass to get inside the house. That was the moment Lisa decided to make her move. She disabled the alarm system, unlocked the front door, and stepped outside holding the official court documents in plain view. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Margaret, who had been in the middle of examining the window for weak spots, spun around with the stone still in her hand. For a split second, both women just stared at each other in complete silence. Margaret's face went through an amazing transformation. First there was surprise, then confusion as she tried to process what she was seeing. And finally, something that looked like pure terror as she recognized the official nature of the documents Lisa was holding. The court papers were in a clear, protective folder, and the official seals and letterhead were clearly visible. To someone who was already in a paranoid state of mind, these documents probably looked like the worst possible thing that could appear at that moment. "What? What are those?" Margaret stammered, unconsciously taking a step backward while still clutching the stone. Lisa stayed calm and professional, the way she had learned to do during her years working in legal offices. She held the documents at an angle where Margaret could see them clearly but couldn't read the specific details. "I think you know exactly what these are, Margaret," Lisa said in a steady voice. "The question is whether you want to make this situation worse for yourself, or if you're ready to stop this nonsense right now." Margaret's eyes were fixed on the official-looking papers, and Lisa could practically see the wheels turning in her head. In Margaret's paranoid mindset, these documents could be anything: a restraining order, an arrest warrant, or some kind of legal action that proved all her worst fears about Lisa were true. The stone dropped from Margaret's hand and hit the porch with a loud thud. Margaret seemed to suddenly realize where she was and what she had been doing. She looked around at the scattered tools, the keys, and the evidence of her attempted break-in like she was seeing it all for the first time. "This was an official inspection," Margaret said weakly, but her voice had lost all the confidence and authority she had been projecting just moments before. "I have the right to—" "No, Margaret, you don't," Lisa interrupted firmly. "You don't have any rights to be on my property. You don't have any authority to inspect anything. And you certainly don't have the right to try to break into my house." Lisa gestured toward the security camera that was clearly visible above the door. "Everything you've done here today has been recorded. The attempted lock-picking, the window checking, the tools you brought to try to force entry, all of it." Margaret's face went completely white as the reality of her situation finally started to sink in. She had been so caught up in her fantasy of being an official authority figure that she hadn't really considered the legal consequences of her actions. Now, faced with what appeared to be actual legal documents and the reality of being caught on camera, she was starting to understand how much trouble she was in. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I was just trying to help the community maintain standards." "By breaking into my house?" Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow. "Margaret, you brought lockpicks and a crowbar to my front door. You tried to force open my windows. You were about to break my window with a rock. Does any of that sound like normal community maintenance to you?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked down at the tools scattered around the porch and seemed to finally understand how her behavior appeared to anyone who wasn't living inside her delusion. Lisa held up the official documents again, making sure the court seals were clearly visible. "I work with law enforcement and legal professionals every day, Margaret. I know exactly what charges apply to what you've been doing, and I know exactly how to document everything properly for court." That was the moment when Margaret's entire fake authority persona completely collapsed. All the confidence, all the official language, all the pretense of having some kind of legitimate power just evaporated. She was suddenly just a middle-aged woman standing on someone's porch, surrounded by evidence of attempted breaking and entering. "Please," Margaret said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. I was just trying to—" "You were trying to break into my house," Lisa said firmly. "And before that, you spent months harassing me and my neighbors, impersonating an HOA official, filing false reports, and making everyone's life miserable with your fake authority." Lisa could see that Margaret was finally starting to understand the seriousness of what she had done. The reality of potential criminal charges was cutting through her delusions and forcing her to confront the fact that her behavior had real consequences. But Lisa wasn't done yet. She had one more surprise that would make this confrontation truly unforgettable and ensure that Margaret never tried anything like this again with anyone else in the neighborhood. Lisa stood there watching Margaret completely fall apart, but she wasn't done making her point. The official documents in her hands had already shocked Margaret back to reality. But Lisa wanted to make sure this lesson stuck and that Margaret never tried this kind of harassment with anyone else. "You know what the really sad part is, Margaret?" Lisa said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "If you had just been a normal neighbor, we probably would have been friends. Mike and I actually like getting to know people in the community. But instead, you chose to spend months making our lives miserable based on rules that don't exist and authority you never had." Margaret was now sitting on the porch steps with her head in her hands, looking like someone who had just woken up from a very long, very bad dream. All the confidence and fake authority she had been projecting for months had completely vanished. She looked smaller somehow, like a deflated balloon. "I thought I was helping," Margaret said quietly, not looking up. "The neighborhood has always been so nice, and I just wanted to keep it that way. When you moved in with your business and everything, I thought—" "You thought what?" Lisa asked, genuinely curious about what had been going through Margaret's mind all this time. "That I was some kind of criminal mastermind operating out of my spare bedroom? That answering emails and reviewing contracts was going to destroy property values?" Margaret finally looked up, and Lisa could see that she had been crying. "I don't know what I thought. It just felt like everything was changing, and I needed to do something to protect what we had here." Lisa felt a brief moment of sympathy for Margaret, but then she remembered all the stress, all the fake violations, all the harassment that had made her life difficult for months. Margaret's fear of change didn't excuse what she had done. "Margaret, protecting the neighborhood doesn't mean harassing your neighbors," Lisa said. "It doesn't mean making up fake rules or pretending to have authority you don't possess, and it definitely doesn't mean trying to break into people's houses." Lisa pulled out her phone and showed Margaret the security footage from that morning. Margaret watched in apparent shock as she saw herself trying different keys, testing windows, and preparing to break glass with a rock. It was like she was seeing her own behavior from the outside for the first time. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, staring at the screen. "I really did all that, didn't I?" "Yes, you did," Lisa confirmed. "And it's all recorded in high definition with timestamps. Margaret, you committed multiple felonies today. Breaking and entering, criminal trespass, attempted burglary. Any one of these charges could send you to jail." Margaret started crying harder as the full weight of her situation became clear. "Are you going to press charges? Am I going to be arrested?" Lisa had been thinking about this question since the moment she decided to confront Margaret. Part of her wanted to see Margaret face the full consequences of her actions. But another part of her just wanted this whole nightmare to be over so she could get back to her normal life. "That depends on you," Lisa said finally. "I have enough evidence to have you arrested right now. But I'm willing to consider an alternative if you're ready to make some serious changes." Margaret looked up hopefully. "What kind of changes?" "First, you're going to call every single neighbor you've harassed over the past few months and apologize," Lisa said. "You're going to explain that you had no real authority and that any violations you claimed to find were completely made up." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Yes, I can do that. Second, you're going to pay for any money people spent fixing your fake violations. Mrs. Rodriguez shouldn't have to eat the cost of lowering her fence just because you made up a rule about fence height." "Of course," Margaret agreed quickly. "I have some savings. I can cover those costs." "Third, you're going to get professional help," Lisa continued. "Margaret, what you've been doing isn't normal neighbor behavior. You've been living in a fantasy world where you had authority and power that you never actually possessed. You need to talk to someone about why you felt the need to control everything around you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "You think I'm crazy?" "I think you're someone who got so caught up in trying to control your environment that you lost sight of reality," Lisa said more gently. "That's not necessarily crazy, but it is something you need to work on with a professional." Lisa helped Margaret gather up all the tools and fake keys that were scattered around the porch. There was an impressive collection of lockpicks, electronic devices, and various other items that Margaret had apparently bought online thinking they would help her break into houses. "Where did you even get all this stuff?" Lisa asked, genuinely curious. "Amazon," Margaret admitted sheepishly. "I watched a lot of YouTube videos about lockpicking and home security. I convinced myself that I needed these tools for official inspections." Lisa shook her head in amazement. Margaret had spent hundreds of dollars on burglary tools and fake credentials, all to support a delusion that she was some kind of neighborhood authority figure. The whole thing would have been funny if it hadn't caused so much stress and expense for everyone involved. As they cleaned up the evidence of Margaret's attempted break-in, neighbors started coming out of their houses. Word had spread quickly that something dramatic was happening, and people were curious about what all the commotion was about. Mrs. Johnson came over first, followed by the Chens and the Rodriguez family. Soon there was a small crowd gathered on Lisa's front lawn, all wanting to know what had happened and why Margaret looked like she had been crying. Lisa made the decision to tell everyone the truth. She explained about Margaret's months of fake authority, the made-up violations, the attempted break-in, and the confrontation that had just taken place. She showed the neighbors some of the security footage on her phone, and everyone was shocked by what they saw. "You mean all those violations you found at our house were fake?" Mrs. Chen asked Margaret directly. Margaret nodded miserably. "I made them all up. I thought I was helping the neighborhood, but I don't know what I was doing." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people were angry about the money and time they had wasted on Margaret's fake violations. Others seemed more confused than mad, like they couldn't quite process that their neighbor had been living in such an elaborate fantasy world. Mr. Rodriguez was probably the most upset. "I spent $300 getting my fence shortened because you said it was too high. My wife and I argued about whether we should just move rather than deal with all these HOA rules." "I'll pay you back," Margaret said quickly. "I'll pay everyone back for whatever you spent because of my fake violations." Lisa was impressed that Margaret seemed genuinely remorseful and willing to make things right. Maybe there was hope that she could get her life back on track with proper help. The real HOA board president, Mr. Davis, showed up after hearing about the commotion from several neighbors. When Lisa explained what had been happening, he was furious that someone had been impersonating HOA authority and creating fake violations. "Margaret, you could have cost us thousands of dollars in liability," Mr. Davis said sternly. "If someone had been injured or had property damaged because of your fake inspections, the HOA could have been sued." Over the next few hours, Margaret personally apologized to every neighbor she had targeted. She admitted that she had no real authority and that all her violations had been made up. Some people were more forgiving than others, but everyone appreciated the honesty after months of confusion. Lisa ultimately decided not to press criminal charges, but only after Margaret agreed to all her conditions and entered into a written agreement outlining her commitments. Margaret got professional help, paid back her neighbors, and gradually rebuilt some of the relationships she had damaged. With her behavior, the security footage of Margaret's attempted break-in and Lisa's perfect timing, with the legal documents eventually made its way onto social media, where it became a viral sensation. People loved the poetic justice of seeing someone with fake authority confronted by real legal documents at exactly the right moment. Margaret learned to be a normal neighbor, and Pine Valley Estates became the peaceful community it was supposed to be. And Lisa learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to stand up to them with confidence and the right documentation at exactly the right moment.